All right, so hi everyone. Thank you all for coming to our last live event of 2020. I know that the past semester was particularly exhausting, and if you're anything like me, you've just about had enough of Zoom. So really, thank you all for coming tonight. Before we start, I'd like to take some time to acknowledge that the territory I work and reside on is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. And though tonight's talk relates to Trump's defeat, which we can all take time to celebrate, the fight against racism is far from over, and we must continue to support those who are fighting against racism and injustice. It's my pleasure tonight to once again welcome to the Wilson Institute my very good friend, Jason Opal. Jason is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History and Classical Studies at McGill, and is an associate of the Wilson Institute. He studies colonial North America, the American Revolution, and New World Slavery, and is the author of Avenging the People, Andrew Jackson, The Rule of Law, and the American Nation, and Beyond the Farm, National Ambitions and in Rural New England. But more importantly, he contributed a chapter to a groundbreaking edited volume titled Revolutions Across Borders, Jacksonian America and the Canadian Rebellion, edited by these two amazing historians, Julien Mauduit and Max Dagenet. This is undoubtedly the highlight of Jason's career, right? I mean, I'm not overselling it here.
Absolutely not.
This is, I just knew. Now, Jason's opinion pieces and short essays on American politics and race relations have recently appeared in Washington Post, the LA Times, The Walrus, The Conversation, Jacobin, and many other media outlets in the United States and Canada. Today, Jason will present a paper titled American Democracy After Trump, Hopes, Fears, and Precedents. After his talk, we'll have a brief Q&A session that I will do my best to manage. And now, without any further ado, Jason.
Thank you very much, Max. Much appreciated. Thanks a lot for the invitation, everybody. Just want to say, too, it's great to see Jack, Pat, Emra, Valeria, I see you as well. Thanks a lot for Zooming in. Thanks to everyone for Zooming in. We are all indeed very exhausted with Zoom. So what I'd like to do is give you a short, hopefully everyone's seeing this, got the American Democracy After Trump screen. What I'd like to do is basically give or offer a short and broad strokes and hopefully provocative take on where American democracy is in the following way. So first, I promise it'll be a quick lecture plan. First, we'll just talk quickly about what my, what I think the takeaways are for the results of the election last month, the results of which are increasingly, are decreasingly in doubt and increasingly certain, and then talk about two ways to look at sort of how American democracy is doing, how it is, in what shape it feels or it is here at the end of this very eventful year of 2020. First, talking about democracy as a kind of practice, and then talking about democracy as a kind of policy. And my talk will be very broad strokes and hopefully, most importantly, quick. Okay, so here is, I would tell my students the first thing is to think about with American politics is to study it at the county level. You get a much better look at politics and political leanings if you look at the roughly 3,000 counties in the United States rather than the 50 states. As you can see, this is the election results from 2016 when Mr. Trump was elected. He won the vast majority of counties, the red counties, the smaller counties. The blue counties are those that voted Democrat for Clinton in 2016. And obviously those are more populous counties. Basically, in a nutshell, what happened last month is this did not change at all, except that there were a few areas in the southern borders of Mexico, with Mexico and in southern Florida, where the blue became slightly less blue, and everywhere else, the blue areas were brighter blue, not so much through proportion, but through turnout. And as a result of that, as a result of the blue areas from 2016 being slightly more, in some cases dramatically more blue, that flipped the several key states in the Great Lakes region, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, as well as two southwestern states. So essentially, this is what happened. In Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, the blue areas turned out more and then first past the post flipped those states. Similar process happened in Arizona because of the area around Phoenix, and perhaps most importantly, the area around Atlanta flipped Georgia. In other words, no one changed their mind, or very few people changed their mind. And you have a very similar, frankly, almost close to a stalemate between red and blue areas with just very, very small shifts, creating fairly dramatic shifts in the electoral college, which after all chooses the president of the United States. One more thing to note before I move on from the results is the persistent and very lazy, in my opinion, media narrative in which essentially wealthier areas or more prosperous growing counties of those 3,000 counties lean Democrat and are blue, and those areas that are poorer and more rural and left behind vote red, vote Republican. That generalization isn't even a very good generalization. I wonder if the origin of it is because a lot of the people who say that live in the state of or near the state of Virginia, near Washington, D.C. There, that generalization more or less holds. The wealthier areas around Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia lean heavily Democratic and have flipped the state of Virginia to a blue state over the last decade. But that generalization, largely based on class, sometimes people talk about it in terms of income, is, as I say, I don't think even a very good generalization. And I'll just give you two examples to the contrary. This is St. Johns County, Florida, in northeastern Florida. This is the third wealthiest of the 67 counties in the state of Florida. Does this look like a place that's rural and forgotten and dying to you? It does not look like that to me. It's a quite wealthy place, and it leans heavily to Mr. Trump. Conversely, this is Hancock County, Georgia, which according to the last data I saw, ranks 158 out of 159 counties in Georgia for overall income. This does look like a place to me that is rural, left behind, and struggling, and it votes heavily Biden. So if these generalizations if the generalization isn't very good, what is a better generalization? And the answer really it should not be much of a mystery. And I think it's frustrating to me when media outlets fail to note it, which is race and religion. Hancock County, Georgia is 76% African-American. St. Johns County, Florida is 88% white. So the red and the blue break down like this. For Republicans, for the red areas in 2020, as in 2016, extremely strong support among white evangelical Protestants, regardless of their income level, and to some extent, regardless of education level. Very strong support among white men, and an emergent appeal, as we saw in 2020 and not in 2016, to specific minority groups, which is an important point and one that should give pause to Democrats who are always congratulating themselves that they basically have to wait it out until America becomes more demographically diverse. That is not the case. There are, in fact, ways where a Republican appeal has shown itself to be quite flexible. Democrats, so the inverse of this, non-white voters, people of color, urban professionals in prosperous areas, but also people making less than $50,000 a year lean heavily Democratic. So again, the class dimension is not the best generalizer. Religion, religious minorities, mainline or liberal Christians, non-believers or people who are unaffiliated lean Democratic quite heavily. And a final point, don't forget about the resurgent left in the United States, manifested in a number of people in Congress and elsewhere who are unashamedly and openly Democratic socialists. So that's what the elections look like. The 2020 elections look very much like the 2016 elections, with the same configurations, the same kind of alliances, and a relatively modest shift in, or not even shift, just a slight change in the overall outcome or turnout, turned those states and turned the election. How then shall we consider American democracy, the state of American democracy, in light of this apparent stalemate, or this apparent sort of a shift towards Biden away from Mr. Trump, but nonetheless, certainly not a renunciation of Mr. Trump. It was a strong showing by Mr. Trump. His base turned out. His normal non-base voters turned out. So what are we to make of this? I think it really depends on how we consider democracy, whether as a practice or as a kind of policy. So I'll put it this way, and again, I'd love to hear your thoughts. This is just me sort of extrapolating here. If by democracy, if when we say democracy, we are meaning a series of well-established norms and practices through which meaningful majorities of people select the representatives who in turn respect their own institutional limits, separation of institutions, and recognize their accountability to voters, if that is how we define democracy, I think American democracy has shown itself to be quite strong and in good shape. And the reason for that is very simple, because it always has. The institutions or the practices of that kind of democracy, of turnout, participation, and widespread acceptance of those practices and institutions are in some parts of the United States going on 400 years old, and in most parts of the United States, at least 200 years old. And we're not talking here simply about elections and high voter turnout or high percentage of at least white men who can vote. We're also talking about things like juries, extremely important in the early colonies as a sort of practice of democratic participation, town meetings in places like New England and those places founded by New Englanders, assemblies, general courts, they're called various things, houses of burgesses, all these institutions and all the practices that go around those institutions are old, they're deeply rooted, and they're very much alive in the United States. After the Revolution, we see this also between the revolutionary period in the 1770s and 1780s, all the way up to the Civil War, a regularization of these practices, the end of all property qualifications for voting, basically the decline of all the sort of elements or remnants of a more European or British aristocratic system, and the triumph of democracy as practice. Captured perhaps most eloquently by Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860. This is a debate he did 2 years earlier, in which a quite elitist and aristocratic, we might say, South Carolina slave owner characterized his voters as mudsills, which is to say normal, dirty people, which Lincoln embraced and carried to victory. This is a graph showing turnout in presidential and then off-season elections in the United States since the founding of the Republic, or even actually before this. You can see very high rates of voter turnout in the range of 80% in this long period through the 19th century. In some places, the turnout exceeded 100% because there was a good deal of shady voting in some times. You see this decline beginning in the early 20th century for a variety of reasons. But more recently, this data only goes to 2018, an uptick. We will see this again from 2020. The turnout was very strong for this last presidential election. Turnout strong, the traditions are strong, the practices are strong, and it shows up also in very quotidian or unremarkable things. This is an image from inside the Philadelphia Convention Center. This is no, overly dignified public space. It's a convention center in which people who were making small wages, and in some cases were volunteers, were counting votes. That's all. They were certifying and counting votes. Obviously, the votes came in slower this time because of the pandemic, but the great non-event that happened here is that no one stopped counting. They just kept counting for several days and came up with the results. And as unremarkable as that might sound, that to me is strong evidence, or it's yet again, a powerful indicator that democracy as practice runs deep and is strong in the United States. But that's not, of course, the only way to think about democracy. It's not perhaps even the best way to think about democracy. I would say that since I moved to Canada 12 years ago, I have a much better sense, or I'm able to at least ask better questions, I hope, about how one can distinguish democratic health in one place and the other. And it seems to me that in much of the modern or postmodern West, whatever we are in much of that world, democracy has come to take on a very different meaning, or a different meaning, which could be described as something like policy. If democracy means, sorry, that's my 8-year-old. Okay. Sorry about that. If democracy means the process by which a high capacity or competent government implements and oversees policies designed to promote the well-being of society at large, of everyone making up the organization of society in a given territory, including both majority groups and the more marginal, if that's what democracy means, then I think American democracy is in much worse shape. And the reason is, again, very simple, because it always has. I'm not sure that it's said enough that the United States founding in the 1780s, the federal government as established, actually doesn't seem to anticipate much of a national social policy, perhaps even not much of a national policy at all. This is a famous quote by one of the architects of the American Constitution, James Madison, in which he's describing that the purpose of the federal government, of the federal state, of the national government, if you want to put it that way, is for ambition, understood as a negative thing, to counter ambition, which is to say, we don't want much of a policy at all. We're trying to actually prevent there being a robust national policy of any kind by making sure that the government is set against itself, that various interests in society, or the powerful interests in society, basically cancel each other out and only allow for a limited kind of government at the national or federal level. The rest of the stuff will be done by the states. And this is captured in their usual architectural metaphors, with delicate pillars being set here or there. Oftentimes the metaphor was the pillars are the states, and then there'll be a ceiling with the federal government. Then the federal government itself is also like an equilibrium between different branches, none of which makes any sense to a different tradition of democracy, in which what you want is a high capacity government to promote the well-being of society. Rather than national policy for society at large, rather than policy for society of any kind, really, I think the more accurate way to put it is that for a large span of American history, in the long 19th century, if you want to put it that way, the policy was instead settler colonialism as white national policy, which is to say, not public policy or policy for the society at large, but rather a continual grant of power to the dominant group in society, white settlers, whether rich or poor, against other people in North America, against other people in their midst. Not a policy to well-organized society, but a policy to enable the dominant group to have at other people in a quest for wealth and happiness, not necessarily in that order. This is an image of the United States as Thomas Jefferson, elected president in 1800, imagined it, especially after he purchased Louisiana from Napoleon, who had no interest in keeping a yellow fever-ridden area of Louisiana. And the idea and the huge gift that the American government gives to white settlers was cheap land, taken by force or by fraud from indigenous peoples. And it's not just sort of like a passive state doing this, but a rather active state enabling the dominant group to pursue wealth and happiness, or wealth and property, at the expense of others inside society. To me, the most obvious example of this would be the policy known as quote unquote Indian removal in the 1830s under President Andrew Jackson and his successor in office. Too often we think of this, or it is referred to as in a kind of passive terms. This is nothing passive about this. This is a policy by which approximately 70,000 people were deported from their ancestral homelands in quite well-organized societies across several thousand miles of very difficult terrain to present-day Oklahoma and Arkansas. That took a massive effort by the state on behalf of the dominant group against others. Jackson himself referred to Americans, real Americans, white Americans as he meant them, as restless millions who would not be held back by something so limiting and something so, in our terms, perhaps democratic as society itself. They would rather not have those limitations on them. And the state, the national state, far from imposing a policy for them or around them, would grant them the power to escape society, to transcend society, to become, in a sense, above the law. This continued after the Civil War and the destruction of slavery. I should go back and note that throughout this whole area, if you look at carefully the areas of the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations that were deported in the 1830s, those areas are quickly drenched with white settlers bringing enslaved Black slaves in these areas. To this day, this band of territory across here usually looks blue in county level voting because it's still a considerable African-American population. Even after the Civil War and the destruction of slavery, this policy, a policy against society, continues. The preemption laws actually predate the Civil War. The Homestead Act follows it, in which basically settlers can essentially squat on or purchase from at very low prices public lands made available by the state. Preemption laws explicitly excluded Black Americans, including those who had been in the United States or in North America since the 1630s. The Homestead Act did not explicitly do so. There's only a few dozen cases of Black Americans enjoying the protections of the Homestead Act. Here's one homestead grant. I'm sorry, it should be larger or clearer, but what essentially says is the Homestead Office of the federal government, located in this case in Nebraska, hereby grants this person 160 acres in a given township. Here, have it. Which is why, to this day, states like North Dakota, South Dakota, and the Grand West were established and are still possessed overwhelmingly by white families. Now, of course, in the 20th century, especially in the 1930s onward, a huge federal bureaucracy, national state of a more modern kind perhaps developed. I used to work near this building, so I always liked the arch as a symbol of the growing size of the federal government. This arch was built from 1933 to 1939. So with the New Deal, and especially during and after the Second World War, the federal bureaucracy grows a great deal, and you have the beginnings of a more national policy. And yet in our own times, I'm 44 years old. Throughout my entire life, the dominant political force in the United States has been to dismantle national policy, national social policy of any kind, a drive often given in exact words of a frontier mentality to open up, to hack away the functions of the state and privatize them, to open public lands to everything from hunting to drilling, to petroleum exploitation, most famously or initiated by Ronald Reagan, but continuing to the present day. Once again, the policy seems to be a policy of no policy, a policy almost sort of like settler policy, in which the idea is that those who have, now basically thought of more as businesses or individual businessmen rather than white settlers, can essentially take what they want. And any limitations on them is a limitation on freedom. And so even so timid a policy as the Affordable Care Act, known as Obamacare, which is based upon a Republican governor's idea to conduce people to purchase private health insurance, stirred a furious backlash, which continues to the present day. And I would say, if you'll forgive the medical metaphors, Obamacare is basically on life support at the present moment. And we will see, it would have died certainly had Mr. Trump been reelected. But that is a remarkable statement about the hostility, the widespread, deep-rooted hostility to national social policy and to democracy in that form, if that's how you define democracy. The thing about the present moment then, to bring us back to right now, and then I'll stop, is that these deep-seated hostilities to national social policy, which have been brought into the open in a most extreme way by Mr. Trump, whose sort of right-hand man, Steve Bannon, explicitly said, our purpose is to dismantle the administrative state, which has been done to a great extent over the last 44 years, and especially over the last 4 years. That drive, that hostility to democracy as national social policy, which is deeply rooted and very much alive and well, just like the practices of democracy are alive and well, is now running up against or baked into American national life because it fits very well with the design itself. In other words, the idea of opposition to national social policy or to democracy as national social policy is not only has grassroots or deep-rooted support, it also finds easy purchase in an institutional framework in which ambition is set against ambition, in which, in this case, the Supreme Court and federal courts more broadly will be well-placed and highly enthused to strike down, prevent, block any kind of effort for national social policy by the Biden administration or frankly any other. How then does this end? Where do Americans go from here? And here I really will say, as happy as I am as an American myself, that the election last month, which I actually thought might result in violence, as happy as I am that did not happen, as happy as I am that things, although rather strangely, do seem to have gone more or less in a democratic way, as glad as I am about all that, I don't see a way out of this. I don't see a way out of our stalemate. I don't see a way out of the current configurations which continue or which hold in place not just competing notions of the United States, but incompatible visions of the United States that offer a political debate, not as in much of the West, over what kind of society you want, but whether you want to have a society at all. I don't know a way out of it. I can imagine one exit is some decisive victory by one group over the other, or one idea over the other. I find that unlikely, given both the entrenched divisions that are nicely visible on the county-wide maps, or the county maps, but also given the institutional framework, which allows for this kind of stalemate, in fact, encourages it, or actually wants it. So a decisive and peaceful victory seems unlikely. A change of heart, highly unlikely, with or without Mr. Trump or his children running for office. I find that very unlikely. And so I'm left, unfortunately, to think about more sobering possibilities, including, but not limited to, low-level civil strife or sporadic violence. I therefore wish I could have something nicer to say here at the end of a long semester, but I guess my comfort is that, as we all know, history is very unpredictable. And surely there's something that I'm not thinking of, or that none of us can think of, that might enable the United States to find its way out of this extremely difficult moment in its history. So that's my extremely broad strokes attempt at a presentation or lecture this evening. And I'd love to hear any thoughts, comments, questions that you might have.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye.
Be safe, everybody. Take care.